Welcome to the Healing the Culture webinar, Winning the Argument on Abortion with Father Robert Spitzer.
I'd like to welcome all of you myself. I've been involved in the pro-life movement since I was really a seminarian, a Jesuit seminarian, almost 40 years ago. And since that time, I've started a couple of pro-life organizations, the University Faculty for Life organization, and then also with Camille, co-started Healing the Culture. In addition, I've published 2 books in the subject, Healing the Culture and 10 Universal Principles, both of them published through Ignatius Press, and additionally have been involved with Camille for over 20 years. Here is the astounding part of that relationship. Over the last 20 years, we've been trying to package the pro-life message, if I could put it in marketing terms, trying to put it in a way that people like yourselves who want to be pro-life evangelists could really deliver the message in a very sophisticated way using universal principles of philosophy and especially what we're going to call political philosophy later today. So we've finally got some really excellent statistics that Camille has gleaned from those studies and teaching these principles in high schools. The upshot is this, that normally when we begin teaching these in a Catholic school, 51% of the people, in the students in the classroom, start off as pro-life, meaning 49% were not pro-life. By the time we finish presenting these principles in just part 1 of the Principles and Choices program, 86% declare themselves to be pro-life, which is a 35% differential. And if you look at that, though, if you're just talking about the group that was not pro-life prior to the beginning, so moving that statistic from 49% and moving it down to 14%, that's a 71% difference. So we know these principles work. We have tested them. And so if you want to take a look at the paper and the video link and start working with Camille here in Principles and Choices, I would definitely encourage it. We know that this is a good way of packaging not only our message for marketing purposes, but packaging the truth. So let's get to it. Basically, there's 2 dimensions to presenting this material. First, we have to transform the heart, and then we have to guide the mind. And as you all know, the heart liberates the mind. If my heart is open to the subject, then of course my mind will want to know the principles to use in order to guide me. So the heart liberates the mind, but the mind also liberates the heart, right? Because the heart, of course, has got all that intuition and all that passion and all that feeling that wants to move the truth into being. But then you have to know, how do I do this? And how do I do this on the basis of sound principles that have come to us over 1,000 years and are accepted by the secular society? How do I present this material and put it in a way that's really solid so that people can understand the rationale? So we do both. The first part of my presentation today is going to be on the heart. How do we move the heart to be open to the pro-life message? The second part is going to be about 7 principles, political, philosophical principles to guide the mind so that you also can really bring this message in a very sophisticated and very accessible, workable way to our students. Let's get to it. Part 1, which is the guidance of the heart. If you look at the screen there, you're going to see this chart on the 4 levels of happiness. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, what has happiness got to do with, moving the heart toward the pro-life message? The answer is everything. This goes back, by the way, to the time of Aristotle in a remarkable book that influenced the whole of Western civilization called the Nicomachean Ethics. And in that book, Aristotle makes an observation. He says, happiness is the one thing you can choose for itself. Everything else is chosen for the sake of happiness. That means everything else, right? This would be like, how do I choose my friends? And we're talking not just high school here. It could be college students. It could be people already in the first part of their careers, middle-aged people, elderly people, doesn't matter. I mean, everybody functions this way. How do I choose my friends? I choose it on the basis of what I think will make me happy. So the definition of this one word happiness is going to make all the difference in the world. So the second, idea is, of course, how am I going to choose my principles? What values or principles am I going to live by? Thirdly, what do I want to, pursue as a career? And how do I want to pursue it, as a career? And of course, how do I judge myself? Am I successful? Am I unsuccessful? And am I worth something? Am I not worth something? Every choice, what spouse I'm going to do, how I'm going to deal with faith and God, every single thing. It's all made on the basis of what I think will make me happy. Now, of course, we don't have time in our classrooms to start teaching an entire course on the definition of happiness. And by the way, you could teach 2 courses on the definition of happiness, because Western philosophy from the time of Plato and Aristotle through the time of Augustine and Aquinas, all the way to the contemporary age with, Max Scheler, with Gabriel Marcel, with Karl Jaspers, and a variety of other people. All of these people, the history of this, both in philosophy, in psychology, and politics, is enormous. So we're going to have to reduce it to a really simple paradigm. And we call it the 4 levels of happiness. And in that paradigm, as you can see on the screen, it goes kind of from the bottom up to the top. Level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So each of these levels represents a definition of happiness, a very different definition of happiness, yet at the same time, as we'll see, the minute I appropriate that, I say, that's what I consider to be happiness, it's going to change everything in my life, right? Because each of those definitions is going to lead, some people down one path, another definition or level of happiness is going to lead them down another path, right? So these things are absolutely categorically important and influential in the conscious psyche, the subconscious psyche, and in the culture itself. So let's just quickly go through, what are these 4 levels? I'm going to concentrate on the transition between level 2 and level 3, because that's the transition in this culture that we have to make sure the kids can make. If they're not going to move from level 2 to level 3, and it's not just the kids, the adults as well, but if they're not moving from level 2 to level 3, you're not going to get a pro-life position out there. It's not going to make sense to them. They have to change the outlook of their hearts. So what's level 1 happiness? Just think of it or define it this way. It's pleasure/material happiness. It's the kind of happiness that comes from the outside, stimulates my body, my nervous system, produces a sense of euphoria, and I'm happy. Bob Spitzer sees the bowl of linguine with extra garlic, lunges towards it, wolfs it down, and then goes, yum. Of course, I'm happy. Bob Spitzer is sitting in the Mercedes 500 E-Class with leather upholstery, feeling the superb nature of German engineering taking me around the curves in an accelerated fashion. And I'm happy. My kinesthetic senses have come alive with great admiration for German engineering, etc. It's very basic happiness. Would we call that kind of happiness deep? No. Would we call it, pervasive and having effects beyond myself? No. Would we call it something that's enduring happiness? No. I eat a bowl of linguine. I want another bowl of linguine very shortly thereafter, etc. So, of course, we would say about this kind of happiness that comes from the outside, stimulates the body. The Greeks called it euphoria. In Latin, it's laetus, Laetus, right? There's luckily 4 different Latin words for happiness, unlike English. And so, of course, we can see that it's very immediately gratifying. It's very intense. Unfortunately, it is not pervasive. It doesn't have very many effects beyond myself. Doesn't last very long. It's not enduring, and it's not deep. It's not making use of my highest psychological capacities and forces. So let's just call that pleasure, materialistic happiness, level 1, really basic. Think linguine. Number 2, this is called helix in Latin, and we might define it as ego comparative happiness. As you all probably know, we all have an ego, that is to say, self-awareness. We have our own inner universe, our own inner dynamic. And having this inner universe or inner dynamic, right, we can split the world in 2. We can have the outer world out there and the inner world in here, my privacy, and of course, the public world outside of me. Now, if we say we're egocentric, that is, we're trying to bring the outside world under the influence or under the dominance or under, at least subservience, under subservience to my ego, my I, my inner world. So we're subordinating the outside world to the inside world, to the ego world. So we call it ego comparative happiness because it's focused on shifting the locus of control from the outside to the inside, namely me. But it's also comparative, right? So there's always a comparison involved in level 2 happiness, Felix kind of happiness. And what's that? And well, we're all interested in how our ego measures up to the little egos around us. Who's achieving more? Who's achieving less? Who's got more power? Who's got less power? Who's got more status? Who's got less status? Who's more popular? Who's less popular? Who's a winner? Who's a loser? Who's smarter? Who's less smart? Who's more athletic? Certainly not me. Who's less athletic? Who's more beautiful? Who's less beautiful? You get the point. There's always a comparison fulcrum. The objective is to point to the self. I achieve more. I'm more popular. I have more status. I'm smarter, etc. When I do that, I feel happy. But if I'm losing, if I'm somehow in the position of inferiority or just holding my own, I'm not so happy. I'm feeling a sense of depression, of being judged, of jealousy, of fear of failure, etc., etc. And we're going to talk about these emotions called the comparison game and the emptiness that follows upon it in just a moment. But for the time being, let's just say that ego comparative happiness is level 2. It comes from having an ego. It comes from trying to shift the locus of control to myself. I'm constantly making comparisons. Who is achieving more or less? Who's smarter? Who's less smart? Etc. And of course, winning is the objective. Losing is not so good, right? Being in the superior position is great. Being in the inferior position, not so good. So the idea then it makes me happy when I'm winning. I'm less happy when I'm not. Let's go to level 3 happiness, because level 3 happiness also depends on our having self-awareness, also depends on having self-consciousness, this ego. And in this particular case, though, we have the opposite reaction to our ego. Instead of trying to point the locus of control to myself, I'm trying to give my inner world away to the outer world. I'm trying to make a positive difference to the outer world. I'm trying to make a positive difference to somebody or something beyond myself. Let's call it contributive happiness. Now, you can get contributive happiness from either doing something or being with somebody. For example, you could say, I've made up my mind. I'm going to go out and I'm going to convince people that the pro-life position is good. I want to save the lives of these babies. I want to save our culture from a complete, moral and metaphysical implosion, right? I want to, rid the culture of the hypocrisy of, of legal statements that follow the Dred Scott decision right into slavery, well, now following it right into anti-life, etc. I want to do these good things. And so I'm going to write a tractate, or I'm going to teach a class, or I'm going to start a program. You could do something, right? And therefore you would have pervasive, enduring, and deep effects, positive effects on somebody or something beyond yourself. But you don't need to do something. You could also be with somebody. So empathy alone can make a huge difference, right, to people. We can make such a positive difference with our lives by just spending time with people, by just sympathizing with people, by listening to someone who's suffering, or by playing a game with our children and so forth. I mean, I remember when I was younger and my nieces were basically very little girls, and I would come over to the house and they go, "Oh, great, Uncle Bob," and they go, "Let's play Crazy Eights." And then I think to myself, "Oh, I hate that game." And of course, I've also got this article I got to write, and somebody, the book publisher's at my door. I got to get the stuff done. I mean, what am I doing playing Crazy Eights? And then I think to myself, who's going to read this article? Okay, a few people, scholars might read the article, but I might change my nieces' lives by just simply being with them, playing with them, and showing that I care about them and love them. Being with is a powerful force of the good. So we can make others, listen to others, empathize and sympathize with others, and that'll do good. I mean, we start, thinking about these things when we're younger. And the reason is because we get this existential anxiety in our lives. We start thinking to ourselves, hey, does my life make any difference? I mean, we're talking here not about somebody in high school. This starts happening in the 5th and 6th grade. We start thinking, do I have any substance? Does my life make any difference? Right? And finally, maybe you get into high school and you start thinking to yourself, gosh, I don't want to get to the end of my life, and I'm 90 years old and I look back on my life and I go, hey, what was the difference between the value of my life and that of a rock? And you have to say, well, nothing. Maybe the rock and more. I mean, at that juncture, right, you're already in incipient despair. You're already feeling deep emptiness and loneliness, a sense of alienation from self, of your life not making any difference. And this is what spurs people to move to level 3. But sometimes they're spurred to move to level 3 through their faith. That's level 4, which I'll explain in just a moment. But essentially, you start thinking to yourself, no, I want to make an optimal positive difference. An optimal positive difference to my family, an optimal positive difference to my friends, optimal positive difference to my church. I want to make an optimal positive difference to my community, to my organization that I'm working with, or my school organization. I want to make an optimal positive difference to the society and the culture by teaching or doing something if I'm so lucky. I want to make an optimal positive difference to somebody or something beyond myself. And all of these categories, family, friends, church, kingdom of God, community, organization, all of them, culture, etc. I want to, everything that I touch, I want to make it. The minute you do that, minute you make that decision to go to this 3rd level of happiness, what's called beatus in Latin, from which we get beatitudo, right? Like the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew, right? It's there that we have made this critical move from level 2 to level 3. Therein lies the conversion of the heart. Therein lies, the capacity to be open, right, to something beyond myself. But we must proceed, lest I run out of time. Level 4, this is where we embrace faith and transcendence as the meaning of our lives. This is where we begin to recognize, hey, we have a transphysical soul. Now, we have a whole program, to talk about the evidence for the soul, medical studies of near-death experiences. I mean, we even have a huge program on the scientific analysis of the Shroud of Turin, right, and the evidence for the resurrection on it. We have a really great, assessment of our five transcendental desires for perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home. All of these things. We got tons of evidence for the soul. But this seminar, I don't have time to talk about it, but some of your students or the people you work with may have a problem with this. Go for the evidence of the soul, and you can really reinforce this. But for the time being, what I just want to say is we're going to make a discovery, at some point in time, that we are never going to be content with this world alone. We were made to desire eternal life. I mean, that's how God made us. And we are made to desire perfect truth and perfect love and perfect beauty and perfect goodness and perfect home. We are made to desire these things. In fact, St. Augustine puts it so perfectly, for thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And somewhere along the line, we know we can pique these desires in people who are in high school. And we have a whole method to pique those desires. And I'm going to just give you briefly those three methods, but we don't have time to discuss them today because I really need to get to how do we apply this specifically to the pro-life movement and these 7 principles. But what I'm talking about here is if we can get people up to the 3rd level of happiness, the contributive, the loving, the empathetic level of happiness, and we can get them up to sublimitas, right? We can get them to the 4th level of happiness. That's transcendent, faith-based happiness. If we can get them up to those 2 levels, we're going to open their hearts. Why? Because the higher levels of happiness, as Aristotle and Plato said 2,400 years ago, are more pervasive, more enduring, and deeper. They're going to have effects way beyond ourselves. Indeed, they're going to endure, they're going to last for an eternity. Love never dies, and they're going to be deep. They're going to use every highest power within ourselves. They're going to use our powers for ideal formation, our powers of moral reasoning, our powers of spiritual relationship and spiritual reasoning, our power of intellection, our powers of creativity, all of our higher powers for truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home. We're going to be using them all. Now, when you really look at that for just a moment, you can see how pervasive the effects, how deeply qualitative the effects will be, how enduring unto eternity the effects will be. Truly, St. Augustine was right, for thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Imagine getting the kids to move from level 2 to level 3 and level 4. If you can do that, then you've got something good. Let's take a look now at our next, I promise I'm going to move a little faster through some of this material. I do want to get through the major principles. But here you're going to see this illustration of the comparison game. I just want to go through it quickly, but bearing one statistic in mind. Starting in the 5th and 6th grade, you can be sure that about 70% of your students, by the time they are seniors in high school, will be ego comparative dominant. They're going to be dominant level 2 identity, dominant level 2 happiness, dominant level 2 purpose in life. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that they're going to live their life as if really the only thing that matters is achieving more, being better, being smarter, being more athletic, being more beautiful, having more status, having more popularity, being a winner, etc., having more power, control. Now you look at that and you go, holy smokes, what's going to happen to a person who excludes contributive meaning, that is to say, doing something purposeful and positive for others, excludes transcendent meaning, excludes their whole transphysical soul, right, from their being? What happens if you're going to do that and just exclude the whole of these two major pervasive, enduring, and deep identities and desires within your being? Here's what's going to happen. You're going to split the world into three parts after you feel pervasive emptiness, right? There's going to be those moments where you're just sitting there looking in the mirror and you're going to see nothing coming back, right? Because you have no purpose, positive purpose in life. You have no connection, identity, prayer with God, right? You're looking in the mirror. Nothing's coming back except this big old vacuous sensation, pit of your stomach, saying, I am empty. My life is empty. And then you start getting weirder feelings of loneliness, right in the midst of when you're with your best friends, so forth. You start getting feelings of alienation, the sense that I'm not at home here, the sense that things are meaningless, empty, right? The whole line of the atheistic existentialists. What you get basically are a sense of the sensation of not being connected, of not living up to your purpose, of being very empty, of being lonely from this spiritual force that you yearn to be connected with, of actually being alienated from yourself and alienated from the totality, like you don't even fit in. Now, that's the first bunch of symptomatic feelings. These things, they drive teenagers crazy, but they don't know. Why am I feeling this? I'm a 10th grader. I had to go out. And of course, what do? They go, I'm just going to go out and find a friend, and we'll go out and play a sports game, and we'll go skiing, and we're not going to think about this. But it is there, it's persistent, and it can drive people to truly deep levels of depression and anxiety amidst all of the attempts to bury it over, right, with the the entertainments of the internet. It's not going to work. It's persistent. But then you get into the comparison game on your screen. You start dividing the world into win, lose, and draw. Well, whatever you do, if the only thing that matters in life is being better and having more success and having more power and status, etc., that's all that matters in life. Don't lose. Because if you do lose, you will go into a deep depression. If you do lose, you're going to go into a real deep jealousy, right? You're going to start resenting everyone around you who has more. And then finally, of course, you're going to feel judged 24/7. And those feelings of inferiority are just going to undermine every form of self-esteem and self-efficacy. This is a horrible outcome for the life of children within a privileged society. It's just horrible. And it can be avoided by one little move to level 3 and level 4. By the way, when I talk to the kids about this, the kids know what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell them about inferiority, depression. They're taking notes a mile a minute. Let's go to drawing for just a second. Drawing is it's not any more pleasant than losing. At first you might think, well, I'm holding my own. I mean, I'm not dying, but there's always the fear of dying. There's always the fear of loss of esteem. There's always the fear of failure. There's always the fear of losing face. There's always the fear of loss of reputation. I think you get the point. And so, of course, these fears go to sleep with you. And those fears can produce just as much depression as actually losing. It can be so debilitating. A perfectly smart kid can walk into an SAT, have one thought: this test is the only thing that matters in my life. It really will be the mark of whether I'm a successful person or not a successful person in my entire life. Panic, the fear of loss of esteem comes in, and they ruin their test efficacy and the score on their test. It happens all the time. And of course, the person who's drawing, they get the old whipsaw. They move from inferiority to superiority, superiority to inferiority. They move from depression on the one hand to elation on the other hand, back to depression on the other hand. Oh, joy. They're moving from ego rage on the one hand and jealousy to ego contempt on the other hand. Do not draw if the only thing that matters is level 2 ego comparative happiness and identity. Well, then there's only one thing left. That's winning. And as I say, the kids get it. They know what's going on here. All I do is relate the story about what happened to me in my physics class in school. And of course, I'm giving a little presentation there, and I'm using the word spectroscopy, but I was pronouncing it spectroscopy. And finally, one of my fellow students came up, and I'd never heard the word before. I just read about it in my physics book. So I'm busy pronouncing it in the wrong way, and this one guy comes up to me and he says, Spitzer, that word spectroscopy, you were pronouncing it spectroscopy 3 times, and now everybody in the class believes you're a consummate idiot. And of course, I'm just completely stunned. And of course, the shock is so grave. I go home at night, right? And I take this, to my bed. I dream it, right? I'm replaying the tape 30 times and then have suicidal feelings. Been there, done that. Oh, how wonderful it is to be a winner. And I thought I was a winner. But then I saw my entire little self-made empire crumbling before my very eyes on the mispronunciation of spectroscopy. And by the way, when you're a winner, never plateau. Because, of course, if you plateau, you'll lose your entire meaning and purpose in life. And you'll revert right back to all the emotions and depression of the losers and the drawers. No good. And finally, of course, winners get that extra bonus that St. Augustine talks about, that feeling of contempt for others. So superior that you walk out there and, of course, believing yourself to be, far superior to all of the other little urchins out there who are just nothing more than obsequious little inferior beings to please and give you adulation. At the end of the day, they can't stand you anymore. The problem with contemptuous people is that no one with self-respect will hang around you. The only people who can really stand to be around a contemptuous person are their mothers. Everybody else is fleeing for cover. Now, if that's the case, then of course, St. Augustine is correct. Contemptuous people always find themselves lonely. And what do they do in their profound loneliness? They experience ressentiment. They experience resentment. They experience ego rage. And then they fly over to self-pity. And then some more ego rage. And then some more self-pity. Whatever you do, if you're going to choose level 2, winning is not going to be any better alternative. All of them will feel existential emptiness. All of them will feel like they're not living up to their purpose and meaning in life. All of them will feel these terrible emotions of the comparison game: jealousy, fear of failure, fear of loss of esteem, inferiority, superiority, contempt, plateauing, loneliness, ego rage, ego blame, self-pity. What a wonderful life. When I tell these kids about this, and I tell them, 70% of you, if you don't hear this message, you're destined for a life that's filled with this. They sit up and take notice. And then they say, help me to get out of here. Now, I don't have a lot of time right now to talk about this. We do have 3 techniques at healing the culture you can get that will help your students to move from level 2 to level 3. The first is to write their own self-manifestation, right? That is to say, that they will write down the questions that they need to ask themselves over the next couple of years and try to answer that are going to make the difference to really getting a contributive and transcendent identity off the ground. And that would be, how do I make an optimal positive difference to my family, to my friends, to my community, to my church, to the kingdom of God, to the culture, to my organization or institution, right, to the society if I'm so lucky, etc. So we want them to think about these things, but the minute they start thinking about how they want to make an optimal positive difference, and we put this little line at the end of the manifestation called, for this I came, if they start thinking that way, all those emotions of emptiness and the comparison game and the depression start going down precipitously. They get it. They get it. Their heart is opening. They don't want to be there. They want to live for purpose. They do want to live for faith. If you give them enough evidence for God, and we've got plenty of it, enough evidence for the soul, and we've got plenty of it, enough evidence for Jesus, and we have plenty of it. If you give them enough evidence and they make that leap, they can just keep right on going. The second thing we work with them on is, how to look at other people so that they can, induce a sense of empathy. And of course, Gabriel Marcel, this great French philosopher, talks about you can't look for the good news in someone and the bad news in someone simultaneously. If you're looking for the bad news, it'll just completely wipe out the good news. And if you're looking for the good news, it'll contextualize the bad news. Bad news isn't going to go away, but of course, it'll contextualize it. You'll see the person in terms of their true good qualities. Now, here's the problem, says Marcel, and we all know it. The bad news is our default drive because ego comparative identity is so dominant in this culture. And ego comparative identity drives toward the bad, looking for the bad news in others. So we got to create an intentional shift in them. We talk about how to do this, right? We talk about if you're looking for what's irritating, what's weak, what's stupid, and what's unkind in somebody, you'll never empathize with them. And if you don't empathize with them, you're never going to love them. You're never going to be able to do the good for them as if it's just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for yourself. Marcel gives us the formula for love. We have to look for the good news in people. That creates the empathetic relationship with them. That frees us to take the focus off ourselves and put the focus on the intrinsically good and valuable and lovable other, which in turn enables them do the good for others and have it be just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for themselves. Now, that's the technique. We talk to them about, okay, how do you do this? How do you look for the good news in others? How do you look for what's kind? How do you look for, what's strong? What are the strengths of the person? How do you look for the gratuitous acts of kindness, the delightful idiosyncrasies, the transcendental mysteries? How do you look for just the sensitivities of others? There's all kinds of things we can focus on in terms of the good news, in terms of the uniquely good, lovable, mysterious, transcendent being of somebody else. And if you're focused on that, the bad news really gets contextualized and empathy no longer becomes a problem. How do we get people up to level 4? That is to say, faith identity. We've got these spontaneous prayers. And the spontaneous prayers are one-liners, easy to repeat, easily memorized. We tell them how to use these prayers when they really need them, right? Prayers like, help, that's always a good prayer, right? Or, the prayer, Lord, make good come out of whatever harm I might have caused. Or the prayer, Lord, please make some good come out of this suffering I'm enduring. Some good for me, some good for others, some good for the church, some good for the people around me, right? The kingdom of God. Just make optimal good come out of the suffering I'm under. Or Lord, snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Or Lord, I give up. You take care of it. Right? All of these prayers. And the most important 2 prayers, Lord, push back the foreboding. Right? When those feelings of depression, anxiety are coming over, just using your hands, Lord, push back the foreboding. And he does. If we keep repeating it, he does. And finally, thy loving will be done. An important prayer. It should be said 30 times a day. There's so much about this can't go through with you right now. But if we can get those 3 things out there, a really productive self-manifestation, to help them to look for the good news in the others, and to get those spontaneous prayers going in their lives, we see a general identity shift, which is absolutely remarkable. A complete change in their hearts, move from level 2, ego comparative focus here on me, and over to level 3, and that's to say a focus on others and society, and a focus on level 4, a focus on God and relationship with God and helping the kingdom. If we can do that, then we know for a fact that we can change them and change their attitudes on pro-life by simply talking about 7 additional principles of the mind. But that's the method to our madness. The first thing is we gotta get them up to level 3 and level 4, out of level 2, ego comparative, comparison game, emptiness, loneliness, alienation, miseries, and they want to do it. They're self-motivated. They're going to want to follow those 3 techniques of the self-manifestation, looking for the good news in the others, and implementing the spontaneous prayers. If they do it, then we've got, we've helped them to move themselves in their hearts. We're not manipulating them. We're just simply pointing out what they already know so that they can freely choose level 3 and level 4. And if they don't freely choose it, it's all over. But if they do freely choose it, there's a whole new heart out there. Now, what do? Well, we have to go through 7 essential political principles to guide the mind, recalling that the heart liberates the mind, then the mind in turn can liberate the heart, guide the heart, help the heart to integrate its highest inspirations and ideals within the society. So let's just go through really quickly. What are these 7 principles that secular society completely accepts? By the way, most of these came from the church, right? That can actually make a convinced 71% of people who were formerly not pro-life to be open and positive about the pro-life issue and stance. What are they? Number 1, the principle of non-maleficence. That's a fancy way of talking about the silver rule. By the way, I'm going to get to a chart that I wasn't able to get to, but I'm just going to get right there very quickly. The second principle is called universal personhood, or full human potential. So we'll talk about that second principle. The third is no unjust law, principle that comes from St. Augustine. The fourth principle, everybody knows, principle of inalienable rights, actually comes from a Jesuit, Francisco Suarez. The fifth principle is what we call the fundamentality of rights, or the hierarchy of rights: life preceding liberty, liberty preceding property, and happiness. And then finally, the principle of the intrinsic limits to human freedom. So let's just get to these principles, because here's the whole point. If your heart is open to the pro-life position, if you are open to making a fundamental contribution to others, an optimal contribution to others with your life, of getting out of the comparison game and of moving toward the Lord, if you're willing to do that, then for all intents and purposes, we think all you need are these 7 principles, and all you have to do is follow them consistently, and you can't not be pro-life. You're gonna be pro-life. So here's the key point in fact. What's the principle of non-maleficence? Just remember the silver rule. Non-male, of course, means don't commit an evil or an unnecessary evil to somebody. But everybody knows the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, Jesus Christ is actually the first person to utter this as an altruistic principle. Do the good for others that you would have them do unto you. The silver rule precedes Christianity by centuries, and no, by millennia. It's in every culture. It's certainly in the Old Testament. It's certainly in Buddhism and Hinduism, and in every religion throughout the world, in every culture throughout the world. It's called ethical minimalism. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. So this is the principle with do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And of course, what does that mean? Don't do an evil to others that you don't want done to you. In other words, don't do an unnecessary harm to others. And if a harm is unavoidable, minimize it. Everybody's going to agree with this principle. Why? Because if they don't, then Thomas Hobbes, the utilitarian, is going to be right. Life is going to be brutish, ugly, and short. We will all be at one another's throats. So the key point, of course, is that we want to have this principle right at the forefront. I mean, you can already see the consequences of this principle for the abortion and assisted suicide movements, right? It's pretty clear, right? Don't do an unnecessary harm to others. Well, abortion is a totally unnecessary harm, and it's the gravest of all harms, to kill an innocent human being in utero. That is as harmful as it gets, right? And clearly enough, it's totally unnecessary because, of course, there's no necessity, to kill somebody in 99% of abortion cases. And we'll talk about exceptions in questions and answers if you wish, but clearly that point. But just ask your students, okay, is this a hard principle to believe in? The golden rule is much harder, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the principle without the knots. Do the good for others you want done to you. I mean, the sky's the limit. There's all kinds of good you want done for me besides avoiding unnecessary harms. So for all intents and purposes then, what I really want to do is get to, principle of non-maleficence. That's all we have to do. Ethical minimalism. We don't have to do any more than that. Okay, the second principle is called universal personhood, or sometimes it's called full human potential. This actually comes from a Dominican friar, and his name is Bartolomé de las Casas. He goes over to the New World. He sees the subjugation that the Spanish and Portuguese are trying to inflict on these people, enslavement and death through the conquistadores. He's outraged by this, and he goes to the Spanish court, and he basically pleads the cause of the Indian people and says, you cannot just arbitrarily kill these people and enslave them. And his opponent, a guy named Juan de Sepulveda, says, oh, yes, you can, because they're not people. They're not persons. They don't have the same mathematics that we Europeans do. They don't have the same level of architecture, the same level of music. Hey, these people, they're subhuman. See, these individuals are subhuman. They're not really people. They're not persons. They don't deserve protection under the law. And of course, Las Casas, who had been an attorney before he became a Dominican friar, says, but you are mistaken, Sepulveda, because of course, you have to presume, and this is just an accident of culture, he says. You learned in your Aristotelian philosophy, did you not, that what really matters is substance and not accidents? Well, the development of these Indians in their culture is merely an accident. I mean, they're going to catch up with European culture, and they're going to catch up with the totality of European culture in mathematics, in music, in architecture, and everything else within a decade or two. And then what will that do to your argument? Because, of course, these Indians have full human potential. They just haven't actualized that potential fully yet. Now, of course, Las Casas, doesn't win the debate because the Spanish and Portuguese want to continue to enslave the Indians. So, of course, they send him packing. But, of course, his manifestation to the Spanish and Portuguese government still stands today, right? He addresses it to the King of Spain, as a tractate on the Indian peoples and the prevention of the outrageous and bloodthirsty actions of the conquistadores. Now, that's a pretty inciting title. But the key thing, you get the point of Las Casas. Every time you judge whether a human being is a person deserving of protection under the law, you must always do this on the basis of their full potential. Otherwise, you're going to make a judgment that they're subhuman, and if you do that, try to rationalize killing and enslaving them, which is a violation of the most fundamental principle, ethical principle, the principle of non-maleficence. You are going to wholesale and categorically violate the silver rule, ethical minimalism. There's nothing left of your dignity. You are ethically vacuous. Now, of course, Las Casas is, thing can be applied, principle can be applied to the pro-life culture. Having a human being in utero, and make no mistake about it, an in utero, a single cell embryo, even unattached, is a fully potential human being. It's a human being because it has a full human genome, a unique full human genome with mitochondrial DNA, which exists in every human being, but not outside the human family. Of course, this is a living organism with this whole, I can tell you by sequencing the DNA in that single-celled embryo, what that human being will have talent-wise, what they'll look like, what their, not just what their gender is going to be, what their athleticism is going to be. I can tell you, I can't tell you what their personality and their decisions and so forth are going to be, but certainly you can know a lot about this unique human being. Now, what's my point? Who's going to argue this is a human being? If it's a human being, says Las Casas, in order to avoid wholesale and reckless undermining of the principle of non-maleficence and causing, just innumerable harms to others, you have to judge them to be persons according to their potential, because their accidental stage of development, their stage of development, first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, is mere accident. There's nothing substantial about this whatsoever. And so if we're going to base things on substance and not on accidents, then of course we're going to have to apply the principle of non-maleficence to every human being, assuming that they have full human potential and assuming then that they are deserving of protection as persons under the law. Third, St. Augustine gives us this wonderful principle, no unjust law. And he put it in a different way, in his tractate on lying. And essentially what he says is an unjust law is no law at all. Now, we know that this has been so often quoted by every single person who had some kind of, social ethical cause. So it's been Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so forth have all used this principle. So it looks like I've got just a few more minutes to bring this my presentation to fruition here, but I'm going to just finish. I want to finish these principles very quickly. But what did Augustine do when he did this? What he did was he subordinated the law, the positive law, the law of legislators, the law of courts, to the principle of justice itself. You shall do no unnecessary harm to others, and you shall give every human being what they need and deserve in order to live a full human life, and you shall do it equitably. That principle, the fundamental principle, is higher than any law. And if a positive law violates that principle, it's no law at all. It deserves to be undercut, and it deserves to be changed because it undercuts the justice that the law is supposed to be premised on. Let me just give you the last few principles very quickly so we can turn to these questions. The first thing of import is the principle of inalienable rights. As I said earlier, this comes from Francisco Suarez. He was a Jesuit, and essentially he in 1612 he wrote a book called De Legibus. And what he said is that the principle of justice is something that the desert, the obligation to observe the principle of justice for every human being belongs to every person in themselves. That's the key point. So it's not just a principle of justice out there. The obligation to treat you justly belongs to you, not only because your creator gave it to you, though he uses that argument, but also because this is the only thing which will allow us to observe the principle of non-maleficence. You have to say everybody deserves, who is a human being, deserves minimal justice by their very rights. And what's minimal justice, says Suarez? Why, it's, of course, the right to life. He's the one who comes up with the terminology of rights. The right to life first, the right to liberty second, and the right to property and the pursuit of happiness third. He presents it in that order. And the main thing, we're going to talk about that order in 1 second, but the main thing to remember is no court or legislature can abrogate the right, because no court, constitution, or legislature ever gave a natural right to anybody, says Suarez. And of course, does Hugo Grotius pick this up, the father of international law? Absolutely. Does John Locke read Hugo Grotius? Absolutely. Does everybody get it? Absolutely. John Locke gets it. Thomas Jefferson gets it, puts it in the Declaration of Independence. Everybody gets it. No one, no court, no constitution can ever abrogate a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property, because, of course, they belong to the individuals by the proclamation of the Creator and by the natural law itself to fulfill the conditions and requirements of minimum justice. Now, if that's the case, then the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, which I don't have time to go over today, they were completely wrong in denying natural right to liberty to black individuals. And of course, in their crazy statement, right, that finding no constitutional right for liberty for black people, we deny that such a right exists, and that the inferior race must be subordinated to the superior race. Now, can you believe that a majority, not a majority, the unanimous Supreme Court said this? Well, the same rationale, the exact same rationale, was used in the Roe v. Wade decision. And of course, we see the same reasoning. They're going to look to the Constitution to find the inalienable right to life of a fetus. They need to find a constitutional right to protect the rights of the constitutional rights, an extrinsic right. The fetus, the embryo, has a natural right to life through the Creator and through its own through the principles of the natural law and justice. And of course, no one can take that away from him, not even the majority of the Supreme Court, whose rationale is completely crazy because they interpret the silence of the Constitution to mean that no right exists, just like the Dred Scott decision did, and forgot about natural rights in the first place, thereby violating that principle of Augustine. An unjust law is no law at all. And the abortion of innocent human beings is an unjust law, and it needs to be turned over. Finally, I don't have time for these other two principles. They're really important. The first one, of course, is the hierarchy of natural rights. It's based on the necessity criterion, right? The right to life has to be a higher right than the right to liberty. Why so? Because the right to life is the condition necessary for the very possibility of the right to liberty, right? If you're dead, your liberty rights are a moot question. And the same thing holds true with the right to liberty. It has to be a higher right than the right to property, right? Because if I tell you you can own all the property you wish, but on the other hand, I get to own you because I'm going to enslave you because you have no intrinsic right to liberty, then of course, I would own property de facto along with you. So, of course, these are the conditions necessary. So what we have here is you can't say in the end run, right, on the basis of natural principles alone, you cannot say that natural rights should be subordinated, right, and certainly the hierarchy. You can't say the right to life can be subordinated to a woman's right to privacy. That's a liberty right. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, it's not just our own courts that have previously proclaimed it before Roe versus Wade. But of course, it's also there in Thomas Jefferson, in our Declaration of Independence, in John Locke, in Hugo Grotius, Francisco Suarez, and the whole history of philosophy. Enough said. Finally, there's an intrinsic right to human, intrinsic limit to human freedoms. Don't have time to talk about it. Very important for the euthanasia issue. But the main thing is you can't impose an onerous burden on one group in order to give more liberties to another group. You can't tell a whole bunch of people, now you're going to have to face, death with dignity and assisted suicide in order to give somebody, the right to have drugs administered by their physician, because you should never force a person to have to, endure the burden, the pressure of death, by relatives, by friends, by doctors, right, to have pressure put on you to commit suicide. And that's exactly what's happening, right? We've got tons of cases of this. Don't have time to explain it right now, but they're laying an onerous burden on a huge group of people who endure the pressure to commit suicide in order to give a few people the right to have physician-assisted suicide. I apologize for going over, but you can see how probative and persuasive these principles are, and why they actually convinced 71% of our people of our students who are not pro-life, 71% to change their minds and to become pro-life. And now we're going to have Katie read some of the questions for us. I'm just going to stay on board here until at least 12:30, 12:35, just to try and get your questions answered. Again, my apologies for going over time, but you can see a persuasive pro-life rhetoric can be put out there where people freely choose to open their hearts and minds to the sanity of pro-life.
What are some good ways to handle the water cooler type of discussion, say with a coworker, in a way that makes the point while also respecting the protocols and environment of the workplace?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, the problem with water cooler discussions is that you got to be very incisive and quick. I wouldn't maybe start with, one of the principles. I'd start with the heart issues. And therefore, I would just say, hey, look, my position really depends on somebody having a contributive identity. And I would try and make a quick distinction between ego comparative identity. And you can describe that real easy. Who's achieving more, who's achieving less, who's got more power, less power, who's, got more status, less status, who's smarter, who's less smart. And you can distinguish that from contributive. How am I going to make an optimal positive difference to my family? How am I going to make an optimal positive difference to my friends, to my church, to the kingdom of God, to this organization, to the colleagues around me, et cetera, et cetera. And just say, if you really think that you're at level 3 contributive, that's what you want your dominant identity to be, then boy, have I got a message to tell you. I'd like you to come and maybe talk to me about these 7 principles in a lengthier way, when we can just have some time over, a meal or a beer, or, some free time at lunch or something like that, where you can have some more time. Don't try and take principles up at the water cooler. Best to try and make the level 2 versus level 3 distinction, ego comparative versus contributive, and then ask for more time to go into the principles. Great question.
It seems that the fundamental question is whether the fetus is a human person. Do you agree with framing the debate that way? And what have you found are the best arguments to make in favor of the personhood of the fetus?
Yeah, I would probably use the same arguments I just made. So that we have to do it in 2 stages if we're going to talk about the personhood of the fetus. Remember, what legal personhood means is that this human being is deserving of protection under the law. But deserving protection under the law means that the law must protect and not sanction the killing of that human life. So that's the minute you get people to say that a human life is a person, that's what you're getting them to. So let's go through just 3 steps to doing this using the principles that I just laid out. Step number 1, you have to show that a single-celled embryo is in fact a human life, right? So what we're talking about here, right, is the single-celled embryo having, and all you need to do is establish 3 things. Number 1, it has a unique and full genome. That's all. It's uniquely, in all the history of humankind, it's totally unique, and it is human, unmistakably human, not other than human. Number 2, if you want to add to that, you can say also mitochondrial DNA. This is the marker that every human being has. It comes back from our ancestor of 200,000 years ago, our common ancestor called genetic or mitochondrial Eve. And of course, we all have this, and no other being other than a human being has it. So that's a second marker. And number 3, the third marker, very clear. This is a living, metabolizing organism, which is going to follow the sequence in its own DNA to its full development. So step number 1, prove to me that this is not a living, metabolizing, fully human, unique human being. Just the onus is on the person who denies that this is a human being. Once you have step 1 done, go to step 2. That's the principle of non-maleficence. All you need to say is, do you agree with this principle? Never do an unnecessary harm to others. And if a harm is unavoidable, then minimize it. Now, if you can get them to agree with it, then follow it up with step number 3, Las Casas' principle of universal personhood. What is that principle again? Every human being. We established that in step 1. Every human being, now we're going to say, must be considered a person, because we must judge that human being according to their full potential. It doesn't matter what stage of development they're in, first, second, third trimester. Remember, that's mere accident. We have to evaluate every human being on their substance. And their substance is their potential. And their potential is determined by their unique genetic code. So the key thing that we have in mind then is that we want this to people to see, okay, if I'm going to judge this person according to their full potential is what they're going to become after they're born and after they're developed, right? Into when you have the final multiplication. If that's how we're going to do that, then of course these people, every single one of them, this is a judgment according to substance, not mere historical accident, right? Then if that's the case, then I'm going to have to say that every single human being is a person. Every single full human genetic, full human unique genome that's going to develop into a person, into a human being, is a person. And that's on the basis of course, universal personhood, which is based on substance rather than mere historical accident. And there's no way out of it, because the only consequence, if you deny the principle of universal personhood, then you wholesale simultaneously deny with it the principle of non-maleficence. You basically say, go ahead and do unnecessary harm to others. That is a violation of fundamental justice. And by the way, it will lead to life being brutish, ugly, and short. And you can really do this very, very quickly just by those 3 steps. Good question.
Most of my family is pro-choice, and one immediate family member had an abortion some years ago. Obviously, this is a sensitive topic around holiday gatherings, yet I don't see them that much outside of those since they live across the country. I'm not looking to start the argument on abortion in those circumstances, but I want to at least explain my views and why they should consider adopting them. Do you have any advice on the best ways to have that kind of conversation with the people closest to you?
Yeah, the first thing, you're absolutely right, listener. Please do not, you know, turn Christmas into a debate on abortion. That's not going to prove helpful, and it probably will create incredible resentment and animosity. Here's what I would do if it were in my own family, which luckily is not for me a problem. The first thing I would do is I'd say, I'd love to talk to you about my views on this. This isn't the right time. Um, I was reading this paper by, let's say, Father Spitzer, like the paper we will send you today after the webinar. I've got this paper. I know it's 27 pages. I know it's a bit of a slog, but can I just send you this paper? I think it kind of represents my own view for why I think pro-life is a reasonable and responsible position from both the vantage point of the heart and the vantage point of the mind. If you'd be open to just looking at this or listening to a videotape that I've got, can I send that to you by email? And then, I'll read whatever you want me to read about your position. And then how about if we, just have a phone call or a Skype call, down the road here and talk about it. And that way, the first, the whole idea, the Jesuits have this whole idea of, always choose the time you're going to bring up something controversial, right? And Christmas, that isn't it. The second thing, to do is to make sure you have what we call a white paper, that there's an exchange of information about our positions where we're not just going right at it right away. So the first thing is we want to exchange positions so that people can leisurely sit down, read about it, and think about it. And then, you just say, hey, look, if you have some time to think about it, you can, dream up all your questions and all the things you want to talk about, and that's perfect. Number 3, right, the old Jesuit rules of rhetoric. Always start with principles and then argue to issues. There's no good just going pro-life, anti-life, and locking horns. Never gonna work. Start first with principles. There's a good old Jesuit expression: never deny, seldom affirm, always distinguish. So what's a principle? A principle is some foundational issue, right? Could be moral, could be metaphysical, like a metaphysical principle, like the principle of non-contradiction, right? Something cannot be both A and not A in the same respect at the same place and time. It's a fundamental principle. We call it an undeniable foundation of our metaphysical and logical thinking. We also have what's called moral principles, right? Like the principle of non-maleficence. Do not do an unnecessary harm to others, and if a harm is unavoidable, minimize it. Now, if people say, I deny that principle, my reaction would be, okay, run, Bambi, run, because you're dealing with a sociopath. But of course they're going to affirm it. And if they don't affirm it, just ask them, do you realize what you're saying about yourself? You're proclaiming yourself a sociopath, conscienceless. So that the point at hand, though, is always start with the principles. Then once you get them to agree to the principles, it's like my dad at the dinner table, right? Would you agree with this principle? Oh, good. Would you agree with this principle? Oh, yes, I would agree with that principle. But if you agree with those 2 principles, then by non-contradiction and consistency, you're going to have to agree with me on the pro-life issue, because, of course, abortion denies full human personhood to every human being, which is a wholesale violation of the principle of non-maleficence. And you said you were a level 3 contributive person. You said you were going to try and abide by the silver rule. Don't do an unnecessary harm to others. Well, if you're level 3, you're a golden rule person, which absolutely includes the silver rule. How can you be saying that? So just remember, these are the three ways to do it. Choose the situation well. Always send a white paper for an exchange of ideas. Number three, argue from principles to issues. Never argue issue on issue. So if you do those things, I think you will be in very, very good shape. But yeah, don't take it on at Christmas. Great question.
How should we respond when people say they support abortion in cases of rape and incest?
Yeah, again, this comes down to arguing from principle versus arguing from issues. Now, I know there are some legislators who say, and I have to agree with them, if I can get people to 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 make partial birth abortion illegal, okay, okay, let's do that. You know, I'm not going to go for the perfect solution in a political, gambit, right? Let's take whatever we can get, and now let's try and improve on it. It's like, when you're dealing with a benefactor and you're asking for money. I remember one time when I was president of Gonzaga, I was asking, a guy for a lead gift for Gonzaga, $10 million. And he said, well, what category do you have me in? And I hadn't told him about the 10 million. I said, well, we got you in the 10 million category. He goes, well, I'm not in the 10 million category. I said, well, what category are you in? He goes, I'm in the 5 million category. I said, okay, let's start there, and now we'll work our way up. Now, it's the same thing in politics, right? You can't argue with principle. You have to take what you can get. However, when you're dealing with somebody personally who says, is it intrinsically right to kill a fetus because they were born out of rape or incest? The answer to that question is no. It is not intrinsically right. This is an unnecessary harm. Now you could say, no, the necessity is there. This person is going to give birth to a child that was, conceived in the most horrible of circumstances. Yes, but time after time, what has the Rachel Institute and so many other people researching in the National Right to Life movement discovered? The best thing that ever happens to a rape and incest victim is when they give birth to the child, even if they give it up for adoption 60% of the time, give that child up for adoption 60% of the time. The best thing that still ever happened is the birth itself, which does in many ways to limit the problematic features of the mode of conception, which of course is horrific. But the principle is you cannot, right, violate the principle of non-molestation. You can't cause an unnecessary harm to others. But the circumstances of conception do not justify, right, people, doing that unnecessary harm to the poor child who is the fruit of that horrible manner in which the conception took place. And so we have to stick to the principle and say, no, it's not right. If we let the principle of non-maleficence go in some circumstances, where do we stop? And the point is, we never stop. This is the point of the enslavement of the Indians. This is the point of the Dred Scott decision. This is the point you can say, never bring out Nazis. Yes, of course it's the point of the Nazi doctors. There was no stopping. Once you decide to violate the principle, once you decide that there is some mitigating circumstance to the principle, historic, and it'll of course be based on an arbitrary historical accident, but nevertheless, once you decide that, right, then the end will justify the means, and it's all over. You will not stop the slippery slope. How much history do we have to read to get there? Plus, we now have all this good research that, right, the birth of the child is very, very often the best thing that ever happens to mitigate the pain under which the conception occurred. So that's what I would say. I know I get a little enthusiastic about these answers, but you don't have to be. You can be very cool-headed when you give the answer.
I have a situation that came up with a company that provides services for us. They assigned someone to our account, and when they reached out to me on LinkedIn, I noticed that they are closely tied to Planned Parenthood and have done work in that area. How do you recommend I handle this? Should I just ask the vendor to assign someone else? Should I ignore it unless it comes up? Or is there a way to engage them on the subject constructively?
Well, that's a really difficult question to answer because you can't answer that question on the basis of principle. At this juncture, first of all, if the vendor is proclaiming that they are pro-abortion, absolutely, you should just say, I'm not doing business with that vendor. End of story. I'm going somewhere else. If the vendor makes a public proclamation that they are pro-abortion, you have all the reason in the world to say, I'm not working with you. I'm going somewhere else. You're just beyond the moral pale for me, and I'm not getting involved with you. Now, what you're asking about, though, is a particular person who's working for a particular company that has not proclaimed itself to be pro-abortion. Just the person has proclaimed himself to be pro-abortion. Now, there's two ways in which you can work this. But whatever you do, go to your boss before you take an action with that particular person. Go to your boss and just say, okay, this person has put on their Facebook, and Facebook is quasi-public. It's not fully public, but it is quasi-public because people can get access to Facebook and learn of the association with Planned Parenthood. So if you want to do something about it, ask your boss first, say, I'd prefer to have somebody else work with me from this company. But if you're dead set against it, I'm not putting my job on the line, to do this, I'll work with that person. That would be my diplomatic solution. But if the boss says, go ahead and find another vendor if this guy is offensive to you, then I would say, I'd go ahead and find another vendor, another person within that particular firm, that particular vendor. And so that's probably how I would do it. Now, it gets really touchy when you look at, for example, the board of directors of a company, right? And you find out that a person on the board of directors of the company with which you're dealing, that person, has, maybe has a position on the Planned Parenthood board. I would not stop doing business with the vendor because of a personal position of someone who is on their board. I would say that that's 2 steps removed. I probably would not do that. But if you're dealing with somebody on a day-to-day basis and it's a real irritant and they are publicly manifesting their pro-abortion position, you at least have a right to say, boy, I disagree with your position on abortion, and I just if you want to talk about it, great, but I just soon find somebody else at your company that's less politically active about something I consider to be intrinsically immoral.
The news that the Principles and Choices program converts so many students to pro-life views is amazing. You mentioned Catholic schools. Is there any
Mhm.
hope for getting this kind of material into other types of schools or even public schools?
Um, I really believe that there is. First of all, obviously we can't talk about level 4 in any way that would sound proselytizing. Remember, that's the faith identity part of the 4 levels of happiness. But you can just, like when I used to go and talk about this stuff in ethics courses at all kinds of large companies all around the globe. And I would go, like I would do like 4,000 managers at some of these big companies. And I would just say, well, there's a level 4, it's faith identity, and I just say, but we're not going to talk about that here, at this company. But frequently enough, people in the company would come up to me and go, well, gee, we all have faith. We'd be interested in hearing about how level 4 affects our business ethics. At which point I would say, oh, I'm happy to start a small group, but you have to be very, very careful in a public school setting about even remotely intimating that you are proselytizing about God in any way. Not certainly not about Catholicism or Christianity, not even about God. You have to be very careful. However, you can do a full bore deal on level 3. And I mean, is there going to be anybody in a public school that's going to disagree in point of fact with the principle of non-maleficence? I mean, the silver rule, don't do an unnecessary harm. Is anybody going to disagree with universal personhood? I mean, if you did, that means you're pro-slavery. I mean, you're not just pro-abortion, you're pro-slavery if you deny the principle, right? I mean, is anybody going to disagree with no unjust law? Is somebody going to say, yes, I want laws from legislatures in the Constitution that are unjust, in a public school or otherwise? Is anybody going to say, I want to deny the principle of inalienable rights? Is anybody really going to deny the hierarchy of rights based on the necessity criterion? Is anybody really going to deny the intrinsic limits to human freedom? I mean, even Locke says that our rights stop where somebody else's rights begin. Even Locke says, the freedom to swing my arm and hand around, stops where your face begins. Who's going to deny this? So I am always hopeful. The problem is getting it through the politics of the public school system. What we haven't done yet, what we want to do, is start working on a version of this that essentially, and we don't need to appeal to God or faith at all. And we don't even have to appeal to a Christian moral ethic, because of course every one of these principles is embraced by Hugo Grotius, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, no problem. So being that way, what we have to find out is what are the requirements we need to meet in order for a public school board to accept this agenda as an alternative alongside a pro-abortion one, but that they will at least take our curriculum as an alternative, to the pro-abortion curriculum. If that were the case, then I would go ahead and say, we got to make every effort to do this, and it's coming. First, we got to convince Catholic and Christian schools, and I think Camille's doing a real bang-up job doing this. But the key thing is she's doing a job, but we do have this as a second step that we really have to engage in. I think it's perfectly adaptable, but we're going to have to find a real good, usable strategy for getting it through the politics of the public school boards.
Science has proved that life begins at conception, but the pro-choice side continues to argue that a woman has a right to take the life of a child. How do you reconcile the differences between legal rights and rights revealed to us when debating the issue? In other words, how can you convince non-believers that moral law is superior to the laws which tragically violate our faith?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. That what you always have to do is go back to principles. And the problem, if you look at the Supreme Court decisions in Dred Scott, that's the one that said that black people had to be subservient to white people, universally, unanimously passed by the by the Supreme Court. It's based on the same logic, as I said earlier, as the Roe v. Wade decision, and by the way, and the Casey decision as well. All of those decisions never went back to principles. All of them fundamentally denied the inalienable right to life, which is in the Declaration of Independence. And also, of course, we have in our 14th Amendment, that no state law can violate the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So already we've got some problems just on the denial of natural rights to the single-celled embryo, to preborn human life, as well as what happened in slavery at Dred Scott with the Indians, with Bartolome de las Casas. We have a fundamental denial of the principle of natural rights. So that's the first thing that again, we have to reestablish it. The second thing we have to reestablish is the full human potential principle, the universal personhood principle. In law school, everybody's going to agree in law school that every human being should be considered a person based on its full potential, not on any historical accident of development. And then, of course, they turn right around and skip over that principle when they make a court case like Dred Scott or Roe versus Wade. So, of course, again, we're dealing with a completely, baffling, violation of principle. The third thing that we notice, and again, these laws, as you put it, is that they're arguing that silence indicates the negation of the right. So, okay, in Roe v. Wade and in Dred Scott both, what the Supreme Court said was, first of all, there's no natural right to life for preborn human beings, and there's no natural right to liberty for Black people. Okay, that's the first thing they say. The second thing they say is, well, now we're going to figure out whether there's a constitutional right. Remember, a constitutional right is one that's declared into existence by the Constitution. Natural right is not an extrinsic right. It's not declared into existence by a constitutional legislature or a plebiscite, a vote. Instead, it belongs to the human being by their very nature. That's how our Declaration of Independence works. The British government is violating our natural rights. That's why we have the right to revolt. Our natural rights are being violated by your unjust positive law. Now, the point is, they say, okay, well, do Black people and preborn human beings have constitutional rights? Now they say, we look through the whole Constitution and finding no precedent in the Constitution, no wording in the Constitution, and no direct precedent pertaining to Black people or to in the case of Dred Scott, or preborn human beings, in the case of Roe v. Wade, we find no. They have no constitutional rights. Now this is a violation of the first law of legal evidence, which is silence is silence. Silence may neither be construed to be yes or no, because it's not yes or no, it is simply silence. Now we have, in two of these very spuriously sophisticated cases, we have now the interpretation of silence in the Constitution, meaning a negation of rights for Black people, negation of rights to life for preborn people in the Constitution. This is unbelievable. And by the way, there are three other logical errors which I point out in my book, 10 Universal Principles, in the same two decisions. It's absolutely stunning. You can tell from all the sophistry, the violation of the principle of silence, violation of logical principles, the violation of the principle of non-maleficence, the violation of the principle of full human potential and universal personhood, the violation of the principle of no unjust law. All of these things are violated, and it's wholesale violated Once you get all those principles violated in a single decision, obviously you know that mischief is afoot, and the mischief will be violent and marginalizing and negative, dehumanizing and murderous indeed. And so it has been in Dred Scott, and so it has been in Roe versus Wade. So essentially, your question is excellent, but that's how I always go back to principle. Never try to argue an unjust law, because of course, you have to prove that the law is unjust. But once you prove that the law is unjust on the basis of principle, you got them nailed. And that's what you have to do.
We have more questions, but we want to respect your time. We'll answer any remaining questions in an upcoming email. Thank you so much, Father Spitzer, for hosting this presentation and answering our questions. The video of this webinar will be made available for viewing within the next few weeks. You will receive a link to the video in an email.
And you'll also receive a link for my 27-page paper that outlines all of these things, along with some of the answers to your very good questions. It's been an honor being with all of you today. Thanks so much, everyone.